Welcome to week 2 of our series on the 4 different ways to differentiate your lessons. If you missed week 1, make sure you go back. We talked about all the different ways to differentiate by content. And today we are focusing on differentiation by process. I'm Tara. I was a 3rd grade teacher for 14 years, and during that time I learned that differentiation was the key to unlocking my students' success. So now I help other teachers differentiate their lessons to meet the needs of all of their students. So the basis to starting differentiation is understanding all of the different ways that you can differentiate your lessons. And really drilling it down to the 4 different ways. You don't need to know exactly which one you're using each time you differentiate, but talking about them separately just gives you a lot of different ideas for different ways to differentiate, because we don't always just want to differentiate by content. That's the one we usually think of. Sometimes we get stuck in the rut of differentiating by content and we forget about some of the others. So that's why we're breaking it down into these 4 different types. So today I'm going to share with you 5 different ways that you can differentiate by process in your classroom. And that's different from content because with process, we're changing how the students are learning. With content, we changed what they were learning. Now we're going to build in some scaffolding. We're going to really adjust the lesson to meet our students' needs, and we're going to give them those supports that they need to be successful. So the first way that we can differentiate by process is by using flexible grouping. So this means that your students aren't stuck in one reading group for the entire school year. That's how I used to do it with guided reading groups. My students would come in the beginning of the year. I would be like, oh, you're reading on a level M, you are in group 1. Oop, you're reading on a level N, you are in group 2. You're reading on a level O, you are in group 3. And pretty much those groups stayed exactly the same the entire school year, unless when I redid my Fontes and Pinnell testing, somebody went up or down a level, they might move a group. But for the most part, my students were stuck in those groups for the entire school year. And first of all, I noticed issues with student motivation when I did that, because some of my students knew that they were always in that low group and they just had given up basically. They knew they weren't getting out of it, so they did not work very hard. So then I switched over to strategy groups, and strategy groups are different from guided reading groups because they're very flexible. Mine changed from week to week based on the assessment that I gave at the end of each week. I would, over the weekend, check those assessments, see how my students did, and regroup them based on the strategy that we had worked on whole group the week before, so I could see exactly what they needed to practice. And then I could pull them in those small strategy groups and really drill down to the skills that they needed. So that's actually differentiation by content, where we're changing what they're learning. But you can also use flexible groups to differentiate by process. Because if you have your students, you want them all to practice the same skill, you want them all to use the same text. You can do that and pull them in their groups, but now you're going to differentiate it by how much support they need. So if you have students who really need a lot of support across the board, they are going to come to you, and you're going to do a lot of modeling for them. You're going to read the text to them. You're going to model how to do the strategy that you're working on. You're going to do think aloud so that they can hear how you are thinking about the text. And you're going to guide them through that lesson. And then your next group might be a little bit more independent. Maybe you're just going to do a few think alouds for them so that they can see how you're thinking about the skill, and then they're going to go on to the independent work a lot more quickly. And then maybe you have an even more advanced group that can read it independently. They're able to apply the skill independently, and then you just need to talk about it and kind of hone in on some of those small changes that they need to make, or ways to challenge them and make their answers even better. So when we differentiate by process, we're changing the how of it. They're all learning the same thing, they're reading the same text, but you are giving more support to those students who need it. The second way to differentiate by process is by using graphic organizers. These are one of my favorite things because it really allows you to provide the support for the students who need it. So this is a main idea and details graphic organizer, so that you could use this in reading. And your students who need to organize their ideas on this before writing, maybe they're doing an open-ended response and they need to find the main idea and details and write about it in a paragraph. Some of your students are going to be ready to jump right in. They are going to be able to read that text, identify the main idea and details, and put that into paragraph form without any extra help from you. But do you know that not all of your students are going to be able to do that? Some of them are definitely going to need some extra support. And this graphic organizer is a great way to do that. They can pick out the topic, then the main idea, then the details. So having all of their thoughts on this page is then going to help them when they go to write it in paragraph form. I sometimes even like to pool those students who are working with the graphic organizer so that I can make sure that they're on the right page, make sure that I'm giving them the support that they need before I send them off to do that paragraph on their own, because I know it's going to be a really challenging activity for them. So in my classroom, what I did is I printed off a bunch of different graphic organizers. So main idea and details, Venn diagrams for writing beginning, middle, and end to help them organize their stories. And I put all of those graphic organizers into a pocket chart. And my students had access to it all the time. So if they ever came across an activity where they thought they needed to break down their thinking before completing it, they could go and get the graphic organizer that matched with what they were doing. There were also times that I had students get the graphic organizers because I required them to, because I knew that they were going to need some of that support. And then I was able to either pull them in small groups or check in with them and make sure that the graphic organizer was filled out well before they took the next step, whether that was writing a complete story or turning it into a paragraph. Just giving that quick check of, are you on the right track, really helped them succeed then when they were working on the final activity. The third way to differentiate by process is by using varied task complexity. So I'm going to give you the example of math open-ended questions for this one. To prepare for state tests, my third graders always needed to practice math open-ended questions because they could get the right answer, but then explaining their thinking was a whole other ordeal. They had a hard time putting into words what exactly they did to solve that problem. So some of my students, of course, were able to do it automatically. They solved the problem. They could clearly explain exactly what they did. And then I had other students who really struggled with this concept. So what I did is I put together some sentence starters for them to help outline the steps that they were going to explain. So first they had to circle the operation that they used. That was a question on the organizer I made. And then I would put a paragraph together and say, the first step I used to solve this problem was, the second step I used to solve this problem was, and then they had to fill in those sentences with the steps that they did to solve that word problem. And that just gave them kind of the idea of what this writing should look like, because otherwise I would get like one sentence like I added, and that was all. That was their full answer. So by giving them that outline, they saw that they needed to include more than just one sentence, and it gave them that format for how to write an open-ended response. And then gradually I took that scaffolding away. So eventually, by the time they were supposed to take the state tests, they were able to do it on their own. But before that, they really needed those supports to help them do it successfully. All right, way number 4 to differentiate by process is by using learning stations or centers. You might already be doing this in your classroom, so you are already differentiating by process. So maybe you have a spelling center or a word study center as part of your reading centers. You can differentiate that by process by allowing your students to choose how they want to access the material. So when we differentiate by process, another thing we need to take into account is our students' learning styles. We know that we have students who are visual learners, we have students who are auditory learners, and we have those kinesthetic learners who need to move around and tactile learners who need to touch something. So when you are doing that center, you can give your students different ways to practice their spelling words or their phonics skills. So one way you could do it is for your visual learners. They might just look at the words and be able to write them and spell them that way. For your auditory learners, maybe they're going to listen to the words being spelled and then they have to spell them out loud as well. And then for your kinesthetic learners or tactile learners, you might have them using magnetic letters to build the words or to build words with that phonic sound. So just 3 different ways that they can practice the same skill, but they're doing it based on their own learning style. So they're choosing a way that appeals to them. You can also do this in science and social studies. If your students are learning new concepts, you might set up 3 different centers around the room and let the students choose which one appeals to them the most. Maybe your visual learners are going to watch a video about the concept to learn about it. Your auditory learners might listen to a story about it. And your kinesthetic learners are going to be doing some kind of activity, something that gets them up and moving, maybe building something. Those are the different ways that you can differentiate by process by appealing to your students' learning styles. And then the last way is to break tasks into smaller steps. So if you give your class a big project to do, again, some of your students are going to be able to take that project, they're going to be able to plan it out all by themselves and know exactly how to finish it by the due date. But other students are going to struggle with this. They're either going to save it till the last minute, completely forget about it altogether, and they really need your help with breaking it down into smaller parts. So we did book reports in 3rd grade, and we would give monthly book reports. So they would have the whole month to work on this project. So some of the students took it and got it all done on time. Other students, we had to set individual deadlines for them along the way so that we could check in, make sure that they were on schedule. Otherwise, they were panicking at the end of the month because they weren't going to have this book report done. So I would set up dates with them. By this date, you need to have read the book. By this date, you need to complete. Sometimes I would give them a graphic organizer. Sometimes it was already included with the project, something that they needed to write. And then I would make a due date for that part. And then the project usually had either an art component or, like for biographies, they made body biographies where they made a person and put the information inside the construction paper to tell about that person. So I would have a date for that to be due. That would be at the end of the month. So just by breaking the task into those smaller, more manageable parts really help the students succeed and get their projects done on time. So if you're doing a really big project, even in writing, if you're working on a writing project that they need to have a final copy done by a certain date, that is when we can break down the different parts of the writing process for them. You need to have your pre-writing done by this date. You need to have your rough draft done by this date. Giving them those specific deadlines along the way and checking in with them is a great way to differentiate by process, because you also are going to have those students who absolutely don't need that. They're going to work their way through the writing process independently and still have that final copy done when it's due. All right, so those are 5 ways that you can differentiate by process in your classroom. If you would like more ideas for differentiating by process, I put a blog post, a link to a blog post in the description. You can head over and read that. And in the description, you are also going to find the link to the Differentiation Conversation Community. That is a private community just for elementary teachers where we are sharing ideas for how to differentiate our lessons and really meet the needs of all of our students. I hope you will join me over there. And this is week 2 in a series, so make sure that you join me next week for week 3 of the series where we are talking about differentiation by product. I will see you then. Oh, and make sure you're subscribed as well so you get the notification when that video comes out. See you then.